Welcome to the deep dive. You know, if you've ever wondered what really kept Charles Darwin up at night, it probably wasn't just the finches. It was this huge question.
Mm,
How does heredity actually work?
that's right. It was a massive gap. I mean, Darwin and Wallace figured out natural selection, this amazing engine for evolution.
Mm.
But the whole thing depends on traits being heritable.
Passed down reliably.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And they just couldn't nail down how that happened,
Right.
or even where the new variations came from in the first place. It was this big glaring hole in the theory.
And the main idea floating around at the time, blending inheritance, that didn't just not help. It actually made things worse for Darwin's theory.
Oh, completely. It was catastrophic, really.
Yeah.
Think about it like mixing paint,
Right.
Say you have a rare beneficial trait, like a darker color pops up.
Okay.
That individual mates with a lighter one.
Mm-hmm.
Under blending, the offspring are medium,
Intermediate.
right, diluted. And then they mate. And that original beneficial darkness just gets weaker and weaker, washed out over just a couple of generations. Natural selection needs stable traits, things that don't just blend away.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to trace how science got from that really problematic idea, blending, through some failed attempts, including Darwin's own, to the breakthrough that finally gave evolution its hereditary engine.
Yeah, the solution that paved the way for all of modern genetics. It's a great story. Let's dig in.
Darwin definitely felt the heat on this. Even his biggest supporter, Thomas Huxley, admitted they didn't have the mechanism. Darwin himself was, well, kind of scrambling.
He was. Sometimes he talked about small, gradual changes. Other times he even seemed to flirt with Lamarckian ideas. Inheritance of acquired characteristics, traits changing through use or disuse, maybe the environment.
Which is pretty ironic, right? The father of natural selection looking back towards Lark.
It shows the pressure he was under. And that desperation led him, in 1868, to revive this ancient idea called pangenesis.
Pangenesis. Okay, what was the thinking there?
The idea was that every single part of the body, your liver, muscles, brain, everything, produces these tiny little particles. You call them gemmules or pangenes.
Like little messengers from each body part?
Sort of. These gemmules were supposed to travel through the bloodstream, gather in the gonads, the reproductive organs, and then get packaged into the eggs and sperm.
Okay. And how did that solve the blending problem in his mind?
Well, Darwin's hope, his assumption really, was that these gemmules varied in number, maybe representing the strength of a trait. But crucially, they didn't blend or change inside the parent. They just collected.
Ah, so they maintain their integrity.
Right. Theoretically, this would preserve traits and even allow changes acquired during life, like a blacksmith's strong arms, to send off more strong-armed gemmules to be passed on.
But it didn't quite pan out experimentally, did it?
No, it got shot down pretty quickly. Actually, Darwin's own cousin, Francis Galton, did a key experiment. He transfused blood between rabbits with different coat colors.
Thinking the gemmules in the blood would transfer.
Exactly. If pangenesis was right, the recipient rabbit's offspring should have shown some influence from the donor's coat color gemmules. But they didn't. Nothing changed.
Okay.
And then came August Weismann, a German biologist. He did this rather famous, maybe slightly gruesome experiment. He cut the tails off mice.
Oh, I've heard about this one.
Yeah, he did it for 22 generations straight, cut the tails off, let them breed, cut the tails off the offspring, and so on.
The prediction being, if acquired traits are inherited, or if pangenesis works by collecting info from body parts.
Then eventually the mice should start being born with shorter tails, or maybe no tails. But nope, generation after generation, the tails were perfectly normal length at birth. Cutting them off had zero effect on heredity.
So that really put the nail in the coffin for pangenesis and for the inheritance of acquired characteristics, too.
It did, and it led Weismann to propose something truly revolutionary. The germ plasm theory. This was a huge conceptual leap.
Okay, what's the core idea?
Weismann basically drew a hard line. He separated the body into two parts. The germ plasm, the cells in the gonads that produce eggs and sperm, and the soma, the rest of the body cells, everything else.
Right.
And his argument was simple. Only the germ plasm transmits hereditary information.
Mm-hmm.
Changes to the soma, like muscle growth or injuries or cut off tails. They don't affect the germ plasm. They are not inherited.
So heredity is sealed off, in a way, protected within the germline.
Precisely. It explained why Galton's and his own experiments failed, and it established a fundamental principle of biology. The information flows from germline to soma, not the other way around.
Okay, so the hereditary stuff is isolated in the germline.
Yeah.
But we still don't know what it is or how it behaves, which brings us finally to the person who actually figured out the rules, Gregor Mendel.
Yes, Mendel. working away quietly with his pea plants, Pisum sativum, back in the mid-1800s. Nobody really noticed his work at the time.
Astonishing, really. It wasn't rediscovered until, what, 1900?
That's right. 3 different scientists stumbled upon it independently. And Mendel's work was the key, because it showed inheritance wasn't like mixing paint at all. It was particulate.
He looked at really distinct traits, didn't he? Like 7 of them.
Yes, clear-cut things. Seed shape, smooth or wrinkled. Seed color, yellow or green. Flower color, purple or white. Things you could easily score.
And he showed that the outward appearance, the phenotype, wasn't the same as the underlying genetic instructions, the genotype.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Traits could be hidden. They could disappear for a generation and then pop right back up. That just doesn't happen with blending.
Let's talk about his first big insight, the principle of segregation. How did that work with the peas?
Okay, so he'd take a plant that always produced smooth seeds, pure line, and cross it with one that always produced wrinkled seeds. The first generation offspring, the F1, they all had smooth seeds.
Wrinkled just vanished.
Seemed to. But then, and this is the clever bit, he crossed those F1 plants with each other. And in the next generation, the F2, boom, wrinkled seeds reappeared.
And not just randomly, right? There was a pattern.
A distinct mathematical pattern. He consistently got about 3 smooth seeds for every 1 wrinkled seed. That 3.1 ratio is famous. Across all his traits, the average was actually incredibly close, like 2.98 to 1.
Wow. That precise.
That precision tells you something fundamental. It screams discrete units. The only way you get that clean 3.1 ratio is that the factors for smooth, let's call it S, and wrinkled S, are separate particles.
And one can mask the other.
Exactly. S is dominant over S, which is recessive. In the F1 hybrid, SS, the S dominates, so the seed looks smooth. But the S factor is still there, unchanged, unblended.
And when the F1 plant makes its own gametes.
The S and S factors segregate. They split up cleanly. Half the gametes get S, half gets S. Then when those gametes combine randomly to make the F2, you get the SS, and S combinations that produce that 3.1 phenotypic ratio. The factors themselves remain pure.
Mind-blowing. No blending at all. Just shuffling discrete particles.
And then he added another layer with his principle of independent assortment.
Okay, what did that show?
He looked at 2 traits at once, say seed shape, smooth wrinkled, and seed color, yellow-green. He found that the way shape factors segregated had absolutely no effect on how the color factors segregated. They sorted themselves out independently.
It's like shuffling 2 separate decks of cards at the same time.
A perfect analogy, which strongly suggested these factors weren't just floating around randomly. They must be located on physical structures. And the factors for different traits were likely on different structures, or at least far apart.
And that linked directly to chromosomes, right? Soon after the rediscovery.
Yes, very quickly. By 1902, 1903, Sutton and Bovary independently proposed the chromosomal theory of inheritance, arguing that Mendel's abstract factors, we now call them genes, were physically located on chromosomes within the cell nucleus.
So the puzzle pieces start fitting together. We have discrete genes on chromosomes. Now, how does the cell physically manage these chromosomes to ensure Mendel's laws actually happen? That brings us to cell division, mitosis, and meiosis.
Right. We need ways to pass this information on accurately. Prokaryotes, simple cells, mostly use binary fission. But eukaryotes, cells with a nucleus like ours, use 2 main methods, mitosis and meiosis.
Let's start with mitosis. What's its main job?
Mitosis is all about constancy. It's how your regular body cells, your somatic cells, divide. Think growth, repair. The goal is to produce 2 daughter cells that are genetically identical to the parent cell. Same chromosome number, same genes.
High-fidelity copying.
Exactly. The chromosomes replicate, they line up neatly in the middle, and then identical copies, chromatids, are pulled apart to opposite ends. You end up with 2 genetically identical diploid cells with 2 sets of chromosomes, usually written as 2X. It ensures all your body cells have the same genetic blueprint, the same karyotype.
Okay, that maintains the status quo. But evolution needs variation, and sexual reproduction involves combining genetic material. That's where meiosis comes in, right?
Precisely. Meiosis is the specialized cell division that produces gametes, eggs, and sperm. And its key job is reduction and variation.
Reduction.
It has to cut the chromosome number in half. Think about it. If egg and sperm both have the full set of chromosomes, diploid 2N, then when they fuse during fertilization, the offspring would have double the number, 4N. The next generation would be 8N, then 16N.
things would get out of control very quickly.
Totally unwieldy nuclei.
Yeah.
So meiosis takes a diploid cell and produces haploid cells, end cells, with only one set of chromosomes.
How does it do that?
It's clever. There's one round of DNA replication, just like before mitosis, but then there are two rounds of cell division, meiosis the first and meiosis the second.
Okay.
Meiosis the first is that really unique part. Homologous chromosomes, the matching pair you inherit, one from each parent, find each other, pair up intimately.
Like finding your dance partner.
Good way to put it. Then, crucially, these pairs line up and are separated. One entire chromosome from each pair goes to one daughter cell, the other chromosome goes to the other. This is the step that reduces the chromosome number from 2n to n.
Uh-huh. And that sounds familiar. Pairs separating.
It's the physical basis for Mendel's principle of segregation. The two alleles for a gene are often on the two homologous chromosomes. When those chromosomes separate in meiosis the first, the alleles segregate into different daughter cells, cleanly.
The cell machinery guarantees Mendel's law. Amazing. What about meiosis the second?
Meiosis the second is much more like mitosis. The chromosomes line up again, but this time the sister chromatids, the two identical copies made during replication, are pulled apart. The end result is 4 haploid cells, the potential gametes.
So meiosis solves the chromosome doubling problem and provides the mechanism for segregation. What about the advantages of the cycle itself, particularly being diploid for most of the life cycle, like in animals?
Well, being diploid is hugely advantageous. For one, you're carrying 2 sets of genetic information, which gives you more flexibility, potentially different versions of genes.
Like having a backup copy almost.
In a way, yes. But maybe more importantly, it allows for dominance. If you have one good dominant allele and one bad recessive allele for a crucial gene, the good one can often mask the effects of the bad one.
So it provides buffering against harmful mutations.
Exactly. The potentially harmful recessive allele can stick around in the population's gene pool, hidden in heterozygotes, without causing immediate problems. It preserves genetic variation, which might even become useful later if the environment changes.
That makes sense. Now, plants do things a bit differently with this alternation of generations. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Unlike animals where the haploid stage is pretty much just the sperm and egg, many plants have 2 distinct free-living stages in their life cycle.
2 bodies, almost.
Kind of. You have the sporophyte, which is the diploid 2n stage. Think of a typical fern or a tree. The sporophyte produces spores through meiosis.
So the spores are haploid N.
Right. These haploid spores then grow, often by mitosis, into a whole separate free-living haploid N structure called the gametophyte.
Okay, a haploid plant body.
Yeah, like the little green fuzzy bit of a moss is often the gametophyte. This gametophyte then produces the actual gametes, eggs, and sperm, but it does so using mitosis because it's already haploid.
Huh. So gametes come from mitosis in plants, not meiosis.
In this cycle, yes. Then the haploid gametes fuse, fertilization, to form a diploid zygote, which grows into the new diploid sporophyte, and the cycle repeats.
Why hang on to that free-living haploid stage if diploidy is so great?
That's a great evolutionary question. One hypothesis is that maybe the gametophyte stage, perhaps being smaller or having different physiological needs, was better suited to certain environments, especially early in plant evolution on land. Maybe the gametes themselves were vulnerable to drying out, so keeping the gamete-producing stage somewhat protected or adapted was key.
Interesting. And there are different ideas about how that sporophyte stage even originated, right?
Yes, 2 main theories. The antithetic or interpolation theory suggests early land plants were basically just gametophytes. The diploid zygote, instead of immediately undergoing meiosis, started dividing mitotically, becoming a new, distinct, initially dependent diploid structure, the sporophyte that was interpolated into the life cycle.
So the sporophyte was a new addition.
Right. The alternative is the homologous or transformation theory, which suggests the sporophyte and gametophyte were originally much more similar looking, maybe like you see in some algae today, and they gradually diverged in form and function.
Okay, lots of evolutionary history packed into those life cycles.
Definitely. But the big picture takeaway is how these cellular mechanisms, mitosis for constancy, meiosis for reduction and variation, provided the perfect physical underpinning for Mendelian inheritance.
So let's try and synthesize this. We started with Darwin's big problem, no mechanism for heredity, and the dominant idea, blending, actively worked against natural selection.
Right. Then we got Weismann separating the immortal germline from the disposable soma. And crucially, Mendel, revealing the particulate nature of genes through those beautiful mathematical ratios. Genes don't blend. They segregate and assort independently.
And finally, the discovery of chromosomes and the intricate dance of mitosis and meiosis showed how the cell physically ensures these particulate genes are copied faithfully, but also shuffled and dealt out in new combinations during sexual reproduction.
Exactly. It all came together. The discrete particulate inheritance, described by Mendel, happened via the mechanics of chromosome behavior during meiosis, finally gave natural selection the stable yet variable raw material it needed to work. It solved Darwin's crisis.
It really solidified the foundation for modern evolutionary biology. It's an amazing scientific detective story.
It truly is.
Okay, so here's something to leave you thinking about. We talked about the advantages of diploidy, that buffering effect, masking bad recessives. It seems like a clear winner. So why, especially in plants like mosses and ferns, has that haploid gametophyte generation remained so prominent, sometimes even the more conspicuous part of the life cycle?
hmm
If being diploid offers such protection and flexibility, what are the selective pressures that keep this seemingly more vulnerable single chromosome set stage persisting so strongly for hundreds of millions of years? What's the advantage that keeps it around?
That's a fantastic question. What keeps that haploid phase so evolutionarily successful in those lineages? Definitely something to chew on.
Food for thought. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanisms that finally solved the puzzle of heredity.
My pleasure. It's fundamental stuff.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll catch you next time.